He was the last person anyone expected to see in handcuffs. For over 30 years, Justice Alistair Thornton wasn't just a judge, he was the judge. The kind of man who made lawyers double-check their arguments before stepping into his courtroom. The kind of man who could silence a room with just a raised eyebrow. His reputation was ironclad, no scandals, no whispers of corruption, just an unshakable dedication to fairness. If you asked anyone in Calvert County to name one person who embodied true justice, they'd say Thornton without hesitation. But on this rain-drenched night, everything changed. The storm had rolled in fast, turning the streets into rivers, the courthouse steps into a slick, shadowy stage. And there, under the flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers, stood Justice Thornton, drenched, handcuffed, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. This wasn't some quiet, behind-the-scenes arrest. No. This was a spectacle. Cameras flashed like lightning, reporters shoved microphones forward, their voices overlapping in a frenzy. "Your Honor, did you do it? Justice Thornton, how do you explain the evidence?" But Thornton didn't answer. He just stood there, rainwater dripping from his silver hair, his usually sharp eyes clouded with something no one had ever seen in him before: confusion. The officers didn't treat him like a respected judge. They gripped his arms a little too tightly, pushed him into the back of the squad car with the same routine indifference they'd use on any other suspect. And as the car door slammed shut, sealing him inside, one terrible question hung in the air. Why? What could a man like Thornton, a man who had spent his entire career defending the law, possibly have done to deserve this? The rumors spread like wildfire. Bribery? A hidden crime? A scandal buried for years? People who had admired him for decades now whispered behind closed doors, wondering if they had been wrong about him all along. But here's the thing, none of it made sense. Thornton wasn't just respected, he was untouchable. He had no known enemies, no dark secrets waiting to be exposed. He lived modestly, donated to charities, mentored young lawyers. So why was he being dragged through the mud like a common criminal? Because this wasn't about justice. This was about revenge. Someone powerful wanted Thornton ruined. And they didn't just want him arrested, they wanted him humiliated, broken, his legacy shredded in front of the entire world. But who? And why? That's the real story. Welcome to Courage Core Stories. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most shocking legal betrayals of our time, when judges get arrested, the case that broke the bench. Before we go further, I want you to imagine something. What if the person you trusted most, the one who stood for fairness, for truth, was suddenly accused of the unthinkable? How would you react? Would you believe the evidence, or would you question what really happened behind the scenes? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And stay tuned. Before the scandal, before the handcuffs, there was just Alistair. Born in the small town of Elmsbrook, Maryland, Alistair Thornton was the kind of child teachers never forgot. He didn't speak unless he had something meaningful to say, and when he did, everyone listened. Not because he shouted, but because he thought before he spoke. His mother was a librarian, a woman who believed books were sacred. His father, a mailman who walked the same route for 40 years, rain or shine. They weren't rich. They weren't connected. But they believed in hard work and doing what was right, even when no one was looking. By age 10, Alistair had read more about the Constitution than most adults ever would. In high school, while others were drawn to sports or drama, he joined the debate team. And not just to win, but to learn how to defend people, even those with unpopular opinions. One teacher once said, "Alistair doesn't argue to be right. He argues to understand." That mindset never left him. He went on to graduate top of his class at Howard University, then earned a law degree from Georgetown, not because it was trendy, but because he wanted to study near the nation's highest courts. While his peers chased high-paying firm jobs, Thornton returned to Maryland to work as a public defender. He once said, I'd rather protect one innocent man $4,30,000 a year than bury 10 for 6 figures. It wasn't long before his talent was noticed. His record? Clean. His arguments? Sharp. His courtroom presence? Calm but commanding. By age 38, he was nominated to the Calvert County Superior Court, one of the youngest judges in the state's history. And that's where the legend of Justice Thornton began. Inside courtroom 2B, there were no outbursts. No games. Just the law. Justice Thornton earned a reputation early on, firm, fair, and completely unshakable. He didn't care if you were a billionaire or broke, a politician or a street vendor. When you stood before him, you stood equal. And you knew he'd listen. One story often told by courthouse staff was about a domestic violence case involving a local deputy. Everyone expected it to be swept under the rug. Instead, Thornton demanded a full investigation and delivered a harsh sentence. When asked if he feared backlash, he replied, "The law doesn't answer to popularity. It answers to principle." His courtroom was known for moving slowly, not because he was inefficient, but because he refused to rush judgment. He'd pause proceedings to ask questions others missed. He'd call recesses just to review a witness's body language during testimony. And if he caught even the faintest whiff of misconduct from attorneys, he'd address it immediately, on record. Over the years, he presided over several high-profile cases. A multi-million-dollar fraud scheme involving a popular real estate mogul, where Thornton issued one of the harshest penalties in county history, sending a clear message: wealth does not mean immunity. A racially charged police brutality case that had protesters lining the courthouse steps. Thornton's ruling. Meticulous, thorough, and ultimately praised by both sides for its clarity and courage. A whistleblower suit filed by a teacher against the school board. Thornton forced transparency, even when political pressure was intense, stating, "No institution, no matter how noble, is above the truth." Year after year, lawyers and litigants knew that Thornton's courtroom wasn't a place for shortcuts or theatrics. And yet, many of them preferred it, because at least there, you knew you were getting a fair shake. He was the kind of judge law students studied. The kind of judge people wrote op-eds about. Some even said, if he wanted, he could have gone federal. But Thornton stayed in Calvert County. Not for prestige, but because he believed every community deserved a judge who couldn't be bought or bullied. To the public, Justice Thornton was more than a judge, he was a symbol. A man who dressed plainly, drove a 10-year-old sedan, and walked to work. He didn't chase headlines. He didn't attend gala dinners. He declined every TV interview. The only place you ever saw his name was on court decisions. But the people noticed. Parents trusted him. Activists quoted him. Even people who lost cases said, "Well, at least it was Thornton, so I know it was fair." The media rarely covered him, not because there was nothing to report, but because scandal never stuck. Rumors about judges are common, especially in small counties. But with Thornton, the silence was deafening. His record was spotless. His life? Almost too clean to believe. And that made him both respected and alone. You see, while the public admired him, his colleagues respected him from a distance. In courthouse hallways, other judges would nod politely. Lawyers addressed him with extra caution. Some even avoided small talk. Not because they disliked him, but because Thornton never played the game. He didn't go for drinks after court. He didn't trade favors. He never owed anyone one. In fact, there were whispers. That maybe Thornton was too righteous. That he made the rest of the bench look lazy or compromised. That he couldn't be controlled, and in politics, that's dangerous. One senior prosecutor once said privately, "You can't charm Thornton. You can't intimidate him. You can't tempt him. He's like a mirror that makes you uncomfortable, because it's too honest." Still, even those wary of him had to admit, the man was brilliant. And whether you loved him or feared him, no one thought he'd ever be arrested. No one, except the people who planned it. By all outward appearances, Justice Thornton lived a perfect life. He had a modest home on Oak Ridge Lane, quiet neighborhood, same house for 20 years. His wife, Elaine, was a retired nurse. They met in college, married young, and were rarely seen apart. 2 grown children, both successful, one a school counselor, the other a civil engineer in Seattle. No wild rumors. No luxury cars. No flashy spending. Just consistency, and calm. At the courthouse, he was respected, even admired. But in private? Small cracks had started to form. Tiny, almost invisible, unless you knew where to look. Some colleagues noticed first. There was the bailiff who mentioned how Thornton had started staying longer in his chambers after hours, not for case prep, but just, sitting there. Staring out the window. Quiet. Or the court reporter who once said she heard him talking to himself, repeating a line from a ruling over and over again. Not loudly. Just enough to suggest something was bothering him. Then there were the little things, Thornton forgetting names he'd known for years. Skipping his usual morning greetings. Growing cold with even his most trusted clerks. To the outside world, these moments meant nothing. But inside those courthouse walls, they added up. There were also whispers. Nothing solid. Just tension. A few defense attorneys, off the record, claimed that some prosecutors weren't happy with Thornton's rulings. Too many tossed out charges. Too many suppression motions granted. Some said he was too sympathetic to defendants, especially in cases involving abuse of power. One anonymous source claimed that internal memos had been circulated, judges who were slowing things down or undermining state interests. Thornton's name was allegedly on that list. And yet, he never mentioned it. Never pushed back. If he felt targeted, he kept it to himself. But here's the question no one asked out loud: was Justice Thornton simply being thorough, or was he starting to feel the walls closing in? Because when power moves quietly, it's often missed until it's too late. To understand how this all unraveled, we need to go deeper, into the man behind the robe. Because Thornton wasn't just a judge. He was also a father. A husband. A man of habits, and of secrets. At home, he was quiet. Not distant, just reflective. He enjoyed gardening. His backyard had a small patch of roses he tended to every Saturday morning. Elaine often joked that he treated those flowers with more care than his own health. He wasn't the type to show emotion in public, but at night, he'd read poetry, mostly Frost and Auden. Not out loud, but softly under his breath. His daughter once said, "He never told me how to live. He just showed me what discipline looked like." He had 1 cup of black coffee every morning. Listened to classical jazz on the way to work. No alcohol. No nightlife. No digital presence. His world was order, logic, and silence. But silence can be a double-edged sword. Because in that silence, Thornton kept things locked away. He never talked about stress. Never admitted when a case wore him down. Even when death threats arrived after a controversial verdict, he brushed them off. "I don't do this for applause," he said once. "I do it because someone has to hold the line." But even heroes get tired. Court staff noticed his hands shook slightly during hearings. At first, people thought it was age, stress, maybe. But later, a colleague found anti-anxiety medication in his drawer. Unopened. Prescribed 2 years earlier. Was he overwhelmed? Burned out? Or, was he preparing for something? One of his former clerks recalled a strange moment just a few months before the arrest. She said Thornton handed her a file to archive, but paused and said, "If anything ever happens to me, make sure people read this." Then he smiled, and said nothing else. That file? It disappeared the day after his arrest. Then there was the issue of his laptop, a personal device Thornton used for drafting notes. Password protected. Encrypted. It vanished too. The official report says it was never found during the search of his home. Elaine, his wife, later told investigators that Thornton had begun locking his study door, even when alone. Whatever he knew, he didn't share it. Not with family. Not with friends. Not even with the people trying to help him. Because Thornton didn't believe in crying for help. He believed in shielding others, even if it meant standing alone. And that made him vulnerable. Because in the shadows of any institution, especially one built on power, there are always those looking for weakness. A moment. A crack. And if you've ever tried to destroy someone whose image is nearly perfect, you don't attack them directly. You isolate them first. You turn the silence against them. You make the strong doubt themselves. And somewhere along the line, that's what happened to Thornton. He wasn't defeated in a courtroom. He was outplayed in the shadows. To understand how a man like Justice Thornton could fall, you must first meet the man who wanted him gone. Julian Devereux. A name that echoed through the Maryland legal system. Born into a family of wealthy lawyers and lobbyists, Julian was raised on strategy, politics, and power. He didn't just want to succeed, he expected to rule. Where Thornton valued patience, Devereux thrived on momentum. He was younger by 12 years, sharper in speech, flashier in style. While Thornton wore off-the-rack suits, Julian favored custom-tailored Italian blazers. While Thornton drove a modest sedan, Julian cruised in a black Jaguar XF. The contrast was visible, and intentional. Devereux was no fool. His legal mind was brilliant. He graduated top of his class from Columbia Law. Clerked at the federal level. By 35, he was the youngest prosecutor in the state to secure 5 murder convictions in a single year. Headlines called him the Silver Knife, cutting, precise, and always one step ahead. He was known for his courtroom flair. Closing statements like speeches. A voice that could charm a jury, or silence a room. Colleagues admired him. Some feared him. Others just wanted to stay out of his way. But beneath the accolades, Devereux was carrying something heavy. Something sharp. A wound that never healed. And that wound had a name. Justice Alistair Thornton. It started years earlier, when Devereux tried his first major corruption case in Calvert County. A high-profile businessman, with clear ties to illegal contracts, was charged. Devereux brought the fire. The press called it a slam dunk. But Thornton dismissed the evidence. Illegally obtained wiretaps, the judge ruled. Due process must not be sacrificed, even for public applause. The courtroom went silent. Devereux's face turned to stone. His victory, gone in an instant. He never forgot that day. To Thornton, it was just another ruling. A decision based on principle. But to Devereux, it was personal. It was humiliation, in front of reporters, politicians, and donors. And worst of all, it was final. Thornton had spoken. No room for appeal. No second chance. That moment planted the seed. But the resentment grew deeper with time. Everywhere Devereux turned, he saw Thornton's name. Award ceremonies. Judicial panels. Law school conferences. Thornton was the man they quoted. The man they called the gold standard. No matter how hard Devereux worked, how many cases he won, or how many headlines he grabbed, Thornton's quiet shadow always stretched further. And it wasn't just jealousy. It was fury. Because Devereux believed he deserved that respect. He believed he was the future of justice. Fast, efficient, ruthless when necessary. Thornton, to him, was a relic. A dusty symbol of hesitation and overthinking. In private circles, Devereux began mocking him. The saint of Calvert County, he'd say with a smirk. Too good to bleed. Too scared to act. Some of his allies laughed. Some didn't. But inside, Devereux wasn't laughing. He was planning. Because when a man like Julian Devereux believes the system owes him, and that the only thing standing in his way is a man too clean to touch, that's when dangerous thoughts begin to take shape. It didn't happen overnight. The plan took time. It began with surveillance, unofficial, of course. A few favors called in. A few private investigators paid off the books. Devereux wasn't looking for real dirt. He just needed a weakness. An opening. But Thornton was clean. Almost too clean. So Devereux changed tactics. If no real scandal could be found, one could be built. It started with a case, a small one. An ethics complaint. A forged letter alleging that Thornton had once influenced the outcome of a parole board review for a former student. Completely false. But it slipped through the system, just long enough to make Thornton uncomfortable. Then came the witness. A disbarred attorney, buried in debt, suddenly claimed that Thornton had accepted money to go easy on a white-collar criminal 5 years earlier. No proof. No trail. But the accusation made it into a few political briefings. Still, Thornton didn't flinch. He didn't fight. He assumed the truth would hold. That was his mistake. Because Devereux wasn't just aiming to tarnish his image. He wanted destruction. The final piece of the plan came together in late October, 6 weeks before the arrest. A sealed court document, altered just slightly, was leaked anonymously to the press. It made it seem like Thornton had tampered with evidence in a sensitive case involving police misconduct. Within days, whispers became headlines. But the true blow came later. The arrest. Orchestrated like theater. No private call. No respectful notice. Just squad cars in front of Thornton's home. Lights. Cameras. A team of officers with orders to treat him like anyone else. Except it wasn't like anyone else. It was targeted. Tactical. Public. Devereux had arranged the press release before the warrant was even signed. He was at the courthouse steps, giving statements within the hour. "No one is above the law," he said, looking directly into the camera. "Not even the judges who once ruled it." And just like that, Thornton's reputation collapsed. The man who had spent 30 years building trust, was undone in 30 minutes. It was clean. Cold. And devastatingly effective. But Devereux wasn't satisfied with just taking his seat. He wanted Thornton's legacy erased. And that's what made this not just ambition, but cruelty. Julian Devereux didn't rush into anything. For a man driven by ego, he was surprisingly patient when it came to revenge. He understood that to bring down someone like Justice Thornton, someone with decades of untouchable credibility, the attack couldn't be loud at first. It had to be quiet. Invisible. Precise. And most importantly, believable. He started with surveillance. Not the kind that shows up in spy films, but the subtle kind. Conversations overheard at court luncheons. Calendar entries quietly copied from assistants' desks. Calls made to former clerks posing as a journalist researching Thornton's career. All designed to study the man's rhythms. Where he ate. Who he trusted. Which cases weighed on him. Which decisions he seemed to regret, if any. Julian began to build a psychological profile, not just of Thornton the judge, but Thornton the man. What time he left chambers. How long he stayed at his weekend cabin. Who he called after a tough verdict. How often he visited his sick sister in hospice. Every detail mattered. Because Devereux knew he couldn't just destroy Thornton legally, he had to hit him emotionally. Personally. That's when he identified the perfect pressure point. A case from 3 years earlier. One that involved a missing piece of police evidence, an acquittal, and a lot of angry voices from the public. Thornton had ruled according to the law. The chain of custody was broken. The evidence couldn't be used. The defendant walked free. But there had always been whispers that the evidence hadn't been lost, but buried. Julian saw his opening. He tracked down the original arresting officer, a man now retired, bitter, and nursing a grudge about how the system had embarrassed him. With the right push, he agreed to talk. For a price. Then came the paper trail. False invoices. Fabricated call logs. A forged memo suggesting Thornton had pressured a clerk to lose the evidence before trial. Devereux paid top dollar for a tech expert who could age digital documents, mimic email metadata, and make the records appear real. Nothing was sloppy. Julian double-checked every timeline. Every witness statement. Every possible hole that could be poked through the lie, patched before it could breathe. And just in case, he had 2 more decoy allegations prepped and ready. Insurance policies. More poison for the well. But it wasn't just about the evidence. It was about perception. Devereux knew that once doubt creeps into the public mind, it doesn't take proof to destroy a reputation. Just suggestion. A single drop of rot, and the whole image collapses. So he fed the whispers slowly. At private dinners. Through anonymous tips. A friendly reporter with a vague story about an ongoing inquiry. A rival judge leaking his concern that the court might be compromised. Like a storm building behind closed doors, the pressure mounted without Thornton ever hearing the thunder. Until it was too late. Devereux's envy wasn't just emotional. It became strategic. A dangerous obsession masked by charm and calculation. He could have walked away. Found success elsewhere. But he chose this path, not just to win, but to ruin. What do you believe drives a person to spend this much time and energy plotting another man's destruction? Is it just pride? Or something darker? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. And think about this, if someone as respected as Justice Thornton can be targeted so precisely, who else might be vulnerable? The final piece was timing. Devereux waited for the right moment, a sensitive point in the election cycle. The courthouse was already under scrutiny for a controversial police brutality trial. Tensions were high. The public was angry. The media hungry. And Thornton? He was presiding over another divisive case. One involving the wrongful conviction of a teenager. One that had put the entire department on edge. That's when Devereux struck. He knew that in times of chaos, people look for someone to blame. And if he played his cards right, Thornton would be painted not just as negligent, but corrupt. Not just misguided, but criminal. And the charge? Evidence tampering. Fabricated proof that Justice Thornton had deliberately suppressed key information, not once, but multiple times, to protect certain defendants. The accusation was staggering. And the supposed evidence? Convincing. Next time, we'll take you inside the arrest. The reaction from the courthouse. And the devastating fallout of Devereux's opening move. Because this was just the beginning. The brilliance, or cruelty, of Devereux's scheme was in its simplicity. He knew that a man like Justice Thornton would never take a bribe. But in the eyes of the law, what mattered wasn't the truth, it was what could be proven. And Devereux made sure the proof was airtight. It started with a bank account. Not in Thornton's name, of course. That would have been too obvious. No, this account was opened under the alias of a shell corporation, a defunct legal consultancy once associated with Thornton's former law school roommate, a man who had died 6 years prior. The paperwork was masterful. Forged corporate filings. A fictitious board of directors. And just enough real information, Thornton's birthdate, a former address, a university tie, to make it all look like something that could have been quietly set up years ago, then left dormant. Devereux funneled the first deposit, $30,000, through 3 offshore accounts before it landed in the shell account. A week later, another $45,000. Then smaller amounts over the following months, all tied to supposed consulting fees paid by a private security firm that had once been involved in a controversial trial Thornton presided over. On paper, it appeared damning. The timeline matched perfectly with rulings Thornton had made in favor of the security firm. And because the company's executives were already under federal investigation for unrelated charges, the suggestion of backdoor deals was easy for the public, and prosecutors, to believe. But Devereux didn't stop there. He had the account tied back to Thornton in subtle ways. An old email address connected to Thornton's clerk. A business card found in the drawer of a desk he hadn't used in a decade. Digital signatures that seemed just close enough. Every detail fed the narrative that Thornton had, for years, maintained a secret source of income, silent, steady, and corrupt. To the casual observer, it was irrefutable. And for Thornton, who had no idea the account even existed, there was no way to explain it away. But if the bank account was the skeleton, Devereux needed flesh. Faces. Voices. Witnesses. And so, he turned to manipulation. The first was an ex-court employee named Angela Ruiz, a former docket clerk who'd been dismissed years earlier for misconduct. She was living paycheck to paycheck, cleaning offices at night, and bitter about her termination. Devereux approached her with a proposition, not directly, of course. Through a middleman. He told her the story he wanted her to believe, that she'd been part of something much bigger, that she'd seen Thornton take calls from shady men in suits, and that her silence could make her complicit, unless she cooperated. At first, she denied it. Refused. But money talks. And fear shouts. After 2 weeks, Ruiz agreed to testify, claiming that on 3 separate occasions, she had personally seen Thornton accept sealed envelopes from unidentified visitors after hours. Next came Officer Marcus Bell, a patrolman with a record of disciplinary action and a pending internal review for use of force. Devereux offered him protection, and a promotion, if he'd agree to place Thornton at a fictitious meeting where a bribe had supposedly been arranged. Bell hesitated. But Devereux made sure he saw the consequences if he didn't play along. Then there was Judge Valerie Elkins. Respected. Trusted. And weary. She and Thornton had disagreed on several high-profile cases, and while she admired his legal brilliance, she always felt overshadowed by his presence. Devereux didn't need her to lie, just to suggest. To say that Thornton had grown distant and secretive in recent years. That he'd become unusually protective of certain rulings. That was all it took. With just a few carefully worded statements, the perception was sealed. Thornton wasn't just accused. He was suspected. And suspicion, in the right climate, becomes its own kind of conviction. The final nail in the coffin came in the form of evidence no one could ignore. First, Thornton's office. Overnight, with the help of a janitorial supervisor on Devereux's payroll, a small metal safe was placed beneath the bottom drawer of Thornton's filing cabinet, an area most people never checked. Inside, stacks of crisp $100 bills. Labeled as case review bonuses. Tucked beside them, a thumb drive containing encrypted documents, including one that suggested internal communication with a private security contact and a falsified calendar entry showing a late-night meeting at a hotel. The documents had metadata that matched Thornton's usual computer, forged, of course, and the USB itself had traces of his fingerprints, transferred using a glass he had used during a charity gala 2 weeks prior. Then came the final blow. His home. Specifically, his cabin retreat near Lake Oran. Hidden inside the lining of a duffel bag, a bag that Thornton hadn't used in years, was a second drive. This one had audio clips. Fabricated voice recordings made using AI voice synthesis, edited to sound like Thornton arranging a payoff. The technology was cutting edge, flawless to the untrained ear, and presented to prosecutors as a recording discovered by an anonymous tipster. When investigators came knocking, they found it all, exactly where Devereux wanted them to. The story wrote itself. The revered judge with a hidden life. Secret money. Hidden meetings. A growing pile of evidence. In a matter of days, Justice Thornton's legacy was not only questioned, it was shattered. But something still didn't add up. Thornton himself was confused. Genuinely. Visibly. There was no guilt in his eyes. Only disbelief. Shock. And a quiet terror that no one seemed to believe his pleas. As the media storm began to swell, and the prosecutors circled like wolves, one question lingered. How do you prove your innocence, when every piece of evidence says you're guilty? In the next chapter, we'll take you behind closed doors, into the interrogation room, where Justice Thornton would face the very system he once served. And into the courtroom, where a legend would be put on trial. From the outside, the case against Justice Thornton was airtight. It had all the hallmarks of an open and shut investigation: digital fingerprints, traceable money transfers, plausible witness testimonies, and physical evidence discovered in all the right places. But what no one could see was that every single piece had been meticulously orchestrated by Julian Devereux. The brilliance of Devereux's deception lay in its subtlety. He didn't just plant evidence. He designed it to pass the scrutiny of federal investigators, defense attorneys, and digital forensics experts. He exploited real-world gaps in record-keeping, leveraging Thornton's lack of a personal assistant, his minimal online presence, and his tendency to trust the system he had once served so faithfully. Take the thumb drives, for instance. Their encryption keys were composed of password fragments Thornton had used years ago, harvested from an old data breach and blended with other personal information scraped from court archives. The email chains and documents were written in a voice that mirrored Thornton's real communication style: formal, direct, and dryly professional. AI tools had been employed to replicate Thornton's vocabulary and cadence, down to the use of semicolons in place of em-dashes. Even his home Wi-Fi router had been breached months earlier, allowing Devereux's team to remotely upload files that would later be discovered during a forensic sweep. The witnesses. Their statements were rehearsed, layered with just enough verifiable detail to pass initial checks. Angela Ruiz remembered details like Thornton's cologne and his preference for silence while working, things that only someone with past proximity would know. Officer Bell's account included a real timestamp and location, pulled from old courthouse security logs and modified to match the alleged meeting. And let's not forget the audio recordings. These weren't just deep fakes. They were polished, lab-engineered pieces of sonic deception. Thornton's voice had been digitally manipulated to appear stressed, rushed, even arrogant, painting a picture of a man trying to cover his tracks under pressure. For those on the outside, the press, the public, even seasoned law enforcement officers, the evidence seemed beyond doubt. Every piece fit perfectly. Too perfectly. The trap was set. The evidence planted. The witnesses compromised. To the untrained eye, and even to seasoned investigators, it looked like the perfect crime, or more accurately, the perfect confession by way of clues. There were no glaring holes. No sloppy mistakes. Only a puzzle that formed a single, damning image, that Justice Horace Thornton was guilty. But here's the question. If you were leading the investigation and were presented with this mountain of seemingly irrefutable evidence, would you suspect a frame-up? Would anything strike you as too convenient? Too seamless? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Because as we've seen time and time again, justice isn't always about truth. Sometimes, it's about who controls the narrative. The fallout was swift. News of Justice Thornton's alleged corruption broke like a dam bursting across national headlines. Within hours, media outlets branded him *the fallen gavel. *cable news hosts pounced, dissecting his career with surgical precision, juxtaposing his harsh rulings on minor infractions with the alleged hypocrisy of secret bribes and shady dealings. The court of public opinion moved faster than any real courtroom ever could. Outside the Calvert County courthouse, protesters gathered, demanding his resignation, demanding answers, and in some cases, demanding jail time. The marble steps he once ascended with dignity now bore chalk graffiti calling him a traitor. Former allies in the legal community distanced themselves overnight. A few publicly condemned him, while others offered generic statements of deep concern. Colleagues who had once revered his integrity now whispered behind closed doors, some out of fear, others out of opportunism. The judiciary, already weathering a storm of public skepticism, began to crack beneath the weight of scandal. Thornton wasn't just a man, he was a symbol. A symbol of order. Of tradition. Of incorruptibility. And when a symbol falls, the damage is never contained. Law students who had once studied his rulings with admiration now questioned the very foundation of legal ethics. Judges across the state faced new scrutiny, every ruling second-guessed, every relationship re-examined. The whispers of systemic rot grew louder. Thornton's name was removed from the university's guest lecture series. A planned documentary on judicial reform, in which he had been featured, was quietly pulled from circulation. And for Thornton himself, the descent was dizzying. He was placed on administrative leave within 48 hours. His security clearance revoked. His chambers sealed. His clerks reassigned. The same courtroom where he once presided with stern elegance became the place he would now face formal arraignment. Friends stopped calling. His wife, Eleanor, long his steadfast supporter, found herself bombarded by reporters outside their home, forced to navigate public disgrace with silent strength. Their son, Michael, a college sophomore studying law, dropped out of school the following semester, too humiliated to continue under the shadow of his father's alleged crimes. Thornton, always composed, now walked with slumped shoulders. His signature gray suit looked looser. His eyes, once focused and unrelenting, carried the weight of disbelief. The betrayal wasn't just legal. It was personal. Soul deep. He couldn't sleep. Could barely eat. He reviewed the evidence again and again, whispering to himself, how? How could they believe this? How could anyone think this is me? But the truth is, people didn't just believe it. They wanted to believe it. Because nothing thrills the public more than the fall of a giant. And Thornton, with his unblemished record, his towering presence, and his unapologetic sense of justice, was exactly the kind of man who made others feel small. His perfection had always irritated some, even as it inspired others. So when the narrative changed, when that perfection shattered, the public devoured it. Thornton had become a parable. A warning. To some, a hypocrite. To others, a tragedy. And in the shadows, Julian Devereux watched it all unfold. Calm. Patient. Methodical. He had lit the match. Now he simply waited for the fire to consume everything Thornton had built. But even the best-laid plans are never truly immune to chance. And in the next chapter, we'll take you inside the interrogation room, where Thornton, for the first time, confronts the nightmare head-on. Where truth and lies collide. And where the first cracks in Devereux's perfect crime begin to show. A special investigator with a formidable reputation, known throughout the state for her tenacity, razor-sharp instincts, and refusal to bend under pressure. If corruption had a shadow, Isabella had a flashlight and the nerve to chase it into the dark. Over the years, she built her career by unraveling complex fraud cases, taking down seasoned politicians, and exposing white-collar criminals who thought themselves untouchable. Her methods? Diligent, thorough, and deeply instinctual. She didn't just follow evidence, she listened to it. Read between the lines. Sensed what wasn't being said. When she was assigned to the Thornton case, most assumed her involvement would be brief. After all, it looked like a slam dunk, a celebrated judge brought down by hard proof, bank deposits, digital records, witness statements, even damning audio clips. The headlines had written the verdict before the courts could. But Rossi wasn't like most investigators. From the moment she reviewed the file, something felt off. It was subtle at first. The way the evidence stacked up too neatly. The way every thread ended in a knot tied so perfectly, it almost dared her to pull on it. Justice Horace Thornton, the same man who once delivered a landmark ruling against prosecutorial misconduct, suddenly taking bribes. Laundering money through offshore accounts with the stealth of a seasoned criminal. She raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Not yet. Instead, she took a breath, flipped open the thickest file in the evidence binder, and started reading. The deeper Rossi dug, the more her instincts stirred. There wasn't one glaring inconsistency. It was more like an accumulation of micro-anomalies, tiny details that didn't quite sit right. Take the bank transfer logs, for instance. The IP addresses matched Thornton's home network, yes, but the timestamp suggested the judge was logged into multiple systems simultaneously, in locations miles apart. A glitch? Possibly. But it smelled wrong. Then there was the email chain, the one where Thornton allegedly confirmed the bribe. The writing was formal, almost robotic. It had none of the linguistic texture of Thornton's real communications. Too polished. Too intentional. And when she reviewed the audio, that clipped, distorted confession recorded on a supposed burner phone, she detected a cadence shift. Minor pitch fluctuations. Enough to raise a flag in her experienced ear. She requested access to the original audio files for forensic reanalysis. Her request was delayed. Then denied. That was her first real signal. Someone didn't want this case reopened. Someone wanted the chapter closed before too many pages were turned. So, she made quiet calls to old colleagues in digital forensics, off the record. She re-examined Angela Ruiz's testimony, noting her body language in the deposition video, the tight shoulders, the brief eye twitch when asked about dates. And Officer Bell? Rossi discovered he'd recently received an internal promotion, expedited, despite a recent reprimand in his record. Coincidence? Maybe. But Rossi had a rule: the moment coincidences start lining up like stepping stones, you're probably walking toward a lie. And this lie? It was wearing a judge's robe and drowning in evidence that was almost too perfect. Rossi's persistence didn't go unnoticed. Within a week of her unofficial queries, her supervisor called her in for a closed-door meeting. He was cordial. Even sympathetic. But the message was clear: Isabella, we have to be careful. This is a high-profile case. The evidence is solid. Don't go stirring ghosts unless you have something real. It wasn't a warning. Not yet. But it was a leash. Still, Rossi wasn't easily muzzled. She kept digging, though now with more caution. She cross-referenced the timeline of Thornton's alleged bribe acceptance with archived traffic camera footage. A long shot, but sometimes the truth lived in the shadows of pixels. Then came the brick wall. The forensic analyst who signed off on the planted USB drive, a man named Dr. Lowell Keene, refused to take her follow-up interview. His office issued a formal notice: all findings have been submitted. No further comment. Another red flag. Isabella felt the pressure mounting. Whispers followed her through the halls. Emails she sent for internal records started coming back, flagged, or lost. Even her personal phone buzzed with anonymous texts: asterisk, drop it, Rossi. Asterisk. She didn't. But she began to realize something chilling. This wasn't just about framing a judge. This was a conspiracy that had infiltrated the very institutions meant to defend justice. And if Devereux's reach extended as far as she suspected, then every move she made had to be airtight. Every note she took had to be hidden. Every conversation had to be assumed monitored. Worse yet, she was alone. Her colleagues, good people, mostly, had bought the story. Why wouldn't they? Everything looked real. Everything was real, on the surface. And so Isabella Rossi, the state's most relentless truth-seeker, found herself at war with not just a lie, but a machine. A machine that had been built to bury the truth in plain sight. But in the silence of her apartment, surrounded by corkboards and files, Isabella made herself a promise. Asterisk, they framed the wrong man. But they also underestimated the wrong woman. Asterisk. And with that, she pressed play on the Thornton audio file, for the 27th time. Because sometimes, truth hides in repetition. And Rossi had no intention of looking away. Isabella Rossi didn't set out to become a martyr. But as the gears of the machine ground around her, and the pressure to close the Thornton case mounted, she found herself walking a path fewer dared to tread, one defined by personal integrity, and a relentless pursuit of truth, no matter the consequences. Her colleagues whispered that she was too involved. Her supervisor warned of consequences for wasting time on conspiracy theories. And still, she pressed forward. This wasn't ambition. It wasn't ego. It was principle. Rossi had seen enough careers crumble under the weight of convenience and compromise. She refused to become another name on that list. Her badge meant something. Her oath still mattered. Even if it cost her reputation, or her job. She worked late, poring over digital logs and metadata. She skipped weekends, tracing witness travel histories and matching surveillance camera footage with official statements. She revisited Angela Ruiz's deposition again and again, catching subtle inconsistencies others had missed, the change in her description of dates, her hesitation before recalling supposedly critical conversations. And despite growing isolation, despite veiled threats and increased resistance from internal departments, she carried on. Because Rossi knew something Devereux hadn't counted on: when truth is buried, the weight of lies eventually collapses. And she planned to be there when it did. Isabella Rossi felt a nagging sense that something was wrong. In a world where evidence can be manipulated, gut feelings can be crucial. Rossi's investigation took her down labyrinthine paths. She requested server logs from Thornton's supposed offshore banking activity, and was met with stalling tactics and redacted documents. Dead end. She subpoenaed private messaging app logs between witnesses. Another wall. But she kept pushing. Eventually, she got her first break, a timestamp anomaly on the email supposedly sent by Thornton authorizing a bribe. The email header showed it was created on a local draft system before being sent through a remote access point. That meant someone with administrative access likely staged the message, but who? Digging deeper, Rossi discovered a correlation between the creation of this email and a late-night login from a remote terminal registered under a now-retired IT officer, who had left the agency abruptly. She hunted down the man, now living in Vermont. He was hesitant, even frightened. But when Rossi showed him the email metadata, his face went pale. "I didn't know what it was for," he said. "I was told to input it into the draft queue. Paid extra. Told it was a harmless demonstration, training material. It wasn't a smoking gun. But it was smoke. And where there's smoke." Rossi also revisited the forensic evidence, specifically, the USB drive found in Thornton's office that contained the alleged bribery ledger. When she reviewed security logs from Thornton's building, she noticed something strange: a brief power failure logged during the same hour the USB was found, an unusual event, especially for a federal courthouse. Cross-referencing CCTV footage, what little survived the outage, she caught a brief silhouette in a restricted hallway, moving just before the power flickered. Whoever this was, they weren't Thornton. Each piece alone was weak. Together, they whispered a pattern. And Rossi was starting to hear its song. The courthouse was suffocating. Reporters lined the marble steps outside, cameras rolling, microphones extended like weapons. Protesters shouted on both sides, some demanding Thornton's removal, others pleading for his innocence. Inside, the courtroom was a cauldron. Every seat was filled. Jurors shifted uncomfortably. Court officers stood taller than usual. The judge, weary but composed, tried to maintain order. The air buzzed with anticipation, tension, and the scent of a verdict already whispered in public. Judge Thornton sat in silence. No robe. Just a gray suit that didn't quite fit the man who once ruled from the bench. His face was impassive. But behind his eyes, storms brewed, of betrayal, of confusion, of disbelief. As the bailiff called the court to session, the prosecution rose, and the show began. The state's attorney was confident, almost smug. He painted a portrait of Judge Horace Thornton as a brilliant man, too brilliant. A man corrupted not by need, but by pride and power. He presented the bank records first, detailing the offshore transfers with surgical precision. The timestamps, the login credentials, the shell company routing slips. Everything pointed to Thornton's personal devices. Next came the witnesses, Angela Ruiz, trembling, reciting her testimony about the night she overheard Thornton discussing favors over bourbon and jazz. Officer Bell, calm and rehearsed, describing the moment he discovered the USB in a drawer labeled private. And then, the audio. Thornton's voice. Or so it seemed. Accepting the payment. Citing the risks of judgment. The courtroom fell silent as it played. The prosecution rested with the air of finality. The story was airtight. But Rossi was just getting started. When Isabella Rossi stood, the courtroom took notice. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't loud. But her presence commanded respect. Her opening words were simple: truth is not afraid of questions. Lies often are. She began by dismantling the timeline, pointing out the timestamp overlaps. Then she introduced the retired IT technician, via video deposition, revealing how the supposed email had been seeded. Next, she questioned Angela Ruiz. Calmly. Gently. She walked Ruiz through her statement, highlighting subtle contradictions, the change in time, the detail that was added later, the moment Ruiz admitted she was offered a job transfer around the time of her testimony. Did anyone coach you on what to say? No, Ruiz replied, eyes down. But were you afraid of losing your job if you didn't cooperate with the investigators? Silence. Then, a slow nod. Gasps filled the courtroom. Rossi then challenged the audio. Her independent forensic analyst revealed the waveform irregularities, edits, pitch shifts. Enough to raise doubt. Enough to suggest fabrication. She ended with the USB discovery, presenting the hallway footage and timing of the power failure. We don't know who placed the USB, Rossi said. But we know it wasn't Judge Thornton. And we know this case deserves something more than a rubber stamp. And as she sat down, the room was no longer certain. Thornton, for the first time, allowed a flicker of hope to cross his face. The air in Rossi's small, cluttered office hung thick with the scent of stale coffee and the weight of unanswered questions. Weeks had bled into months since Justice Thornton's arrest, and despite the growing inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, a definitive breakthrough remained elusive. Rossi, a tenacious investigator with a reputation for seeing patterns where others saw only chaos, had been tirelessly sifting through the digital detritus surrounding the case. He had revisited witness statements, cross-referenced financial records, and meticulously mapped out the timeline of events leading up to that rain-soaked night. Each piece of the puzzle seemed to fit, yet the overall picture remained stubbornly incomplete, a nagging sense of something crucial missing. He had initially dismissed the mountain of digital files seized from Thornton's chambers and personal devices. They appeared innocuous, filled with judicial opinions, legal research, and routine correspondence. But Rossi, driven by an instinct that had served him well throughout his career, decided to take another look, this time focusing on encrypted communications. He knew that in the modern age, secrets often resided not in dusty ledgers but in the hidden corners of the digital realm. Days turned into nights as Rossi, hunched over his computer, employed specialized software to bypass the layers of encryption. It was a painstaking process, each decryption attempt a potential dead end. Just as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, a breakthrough occurred. A series of encrypted emails, cleverly disguised within seemingly innocuous file names, began to yield their secrets. The sender? A name that sent a jolt of icy realization through Rossi, Julian Devereux. The significance of this discovery was monumental. Devereux, the ambitious and outwardly supportive colleague who had so readily stepped into the void left by Thornton's suspension, had always maintained a carefully cultivated air of detached concern. But these encrypted exchanges painted a drastically different picture, revealing a level of calculated malice that sent a chill down Rossi's spine. This wasn't just about professional rivalry, this was a meticulously orchestrated takedown. The hidden document, these digital whispers from the shadows, held the key to unlocking the entire conspiracy. The decrypted emails laid bare Devereux's intricate and malevolent scheme with chilling clarity. They revealed a man consumed by ambition, his every interaction with Thornton poisoned by envy and a ruthless desire for advancement. The emails detailed his systematic efforts to undermine Thornton's reputation, starting with subtle whispers and escalating to the fabrication of compromising evidence. Crucially, the correspondence outlined Devereux's meticulous planning of the staged arrest. He had cultivated relationships with disgruntled elements within the police department, exploiting their personal grievances and offering them incentives to participate in the charade. The emails revealed how Devereux had manipulated timelines, planted misleading clues, and even orchestrated the involvement of the media to ensure maximum public humiliation for Thornton. The motive was stark and unambiguous: to clear Thornton's path and seize his prestigious position as the presiding judge. Devereux saw Thornton as an insurmountable obstacle to his own ascent, a figure whose integrity and standing cast a long shadow over his own less-than-stellar career. The emails revealed a man consumed by a narcissistic belief in his own superiority and a chilling disregard for the collateral damage his actions would inflict. They documented his gloating over each successful step of his plan, his cold calculations as he manipulated events and people like pawns on a chessboard. The level of premeditation was staggering, transforming what appeared to be a case of judicial misconduct into a calculated act of professional assassination. The emergence of the encrypted emails sent shockwaves through the courtroom, the carefully constructed edifice of the prosecution's case beginning to fissure and crumble with alarming speed. Rossi, armed with this irrefutable digital evidence, presented his findings to Thornton's defense team. The impact was immediate and transformative. Armed with the undeniable proof of Devereux's manipulation, the defense launched a swift and decisive counterattack. Key witnesses, whose testimonies had formed the backbone of the prosecution's case, were recalled to the stand. Confronted with the damning content of Devereux's emails and the exposure of his intricate web of deceit, their carefully rehearsed stories began to unravel. Some, burdened by guilt and the fear of being implicated in Devereux's criminal enterprise, recanted their testimonies entirely, admitting they had been coerced or manipulated by Devereux. Others, their credibility shattered by the revelation of Devereux's influence, offered hesitant and contradictory accounts, their previous certainty dissolving into a palpable unease. The prosecution, once confident and assertive, now found itself on increasingly shaky ground. Their arguments, built on what was now clearly revealed as a foundation of lies and manipulation, lost their persuasive power. The carefully curated narrative they had presented to the jury began to disintegrate under the weight of the newly revealed truth. The air in the courtroom shifted, the initial presumption of Thornton's guilt replaced by a growing sense of outrage and the dawning realization of a grave injustice. The tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable as the jury filed back in, their faces solemn and unreadable. Justice Thornton, who had maintained a stoic composure throughout the ordeal, sat with a flicker of hope in his eyes, the ordeal having etched lines of weariness onto his face. The silence in the room was profound, broken only by the hushed whispers of anticipation. The foreperson rose, her voice clear and steady as she delivered the verdict that would determine the course of Justice Thornton's life and the integrity of the legal system itself. In the matter of the state versus Alistair Thornton, she announced, her gaze meeting Thornton's, "We the jury find the defendant, not guilty." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. A wave of relief washed over Thornton, the years of unwavering dedication to justice seemingly vindicated in that single pronouncement. His legal team exchanged relieved glances, the arduous battle finally won. The cloud of suspicion that had hung over him for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of profound relief and the promise of eventual vindication. With Thornton's acquittal secured and the evidence of Devereux's elaborate scheme laid bare, the wheels of justice turned swiftly in a new direction. An investigation was immediately launched into Devereux's actions, the encrypted emails serving as irrefutable proof of his criminal conduct. The same officers who had once arrested Justice Thornton now found themselves placing handcuffs on Julian Devereux. The shock on his face was a stark contrast to the composed demeanor he had maintained throughout Thornton's trial. Stripped of his judicial robes and the veneer of respectability he had so carefully cultivated, Devereux was brought to justice to face the consequences of his ambition and his calculated betrayal. The charges against him were severe, ranging from obstruction of justice and perjury to conspiracy and potentially even more serious offenses depending on the full extent of his actions. His downfall was swift and complete, a stark reminder that even those who operate within the system are not above its reach. The case of Justice Thornton served as a stark and unsettling reminder of the inherent fragility of justice. It highlighted the uncomfortable truth that even the most respected pillars of the community, those entrusted with upholding the law, can become targets of malice and deceit. The narrative underscored the critical importance of due process, the rigorous examination of evidence, and the unwavering pursuit of truth, even when the initial appearances seemed damning. Thornton's ordeal exposed the potential for ambition and envy to corrupt even those within the legal system, demonstrating how easily appearances can be manipulated and how quickly reputations, built over decades of dedicated service, can be threatened. It served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the devastating consequences of allowing personal agendas to undermine the principles of justice. Furthermore, the case illuminated the vital role of diligent investigation and the courage of individuals like Rossi who are willing to look beyond the surface and challenge prevailing narratives. It emphasized that the pursuit of truth often requires tenacity, skepticism, and a refusal to accept easy answers. Ultimately, Justice Thornton's vindication, though hard-won, reaffirmed the enduring power of truth and the resilience of a system that, while fallible, possesses the capacity for self-correction. It served as a testament to the idea that even when the scales of justice are tipped by deception, the unwavering pursuit of truth can eventually restore their balance. Justice, though tested by the storm of deceit, ultimately prevailed, emerging stronger and more resolute. The truth, though buried beneath layers of lies and manipulation, was finally brought to the illuminating light of day, vindicating a man who dedicated his life to its unwavering application. Thank you for bearing witness to this gripping episode of Courage Core Stories. If you found this tale of betrayal and ultimate triumph thought-provoking and compelling, please take a moment to like this video, share it with your network, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating narratives that explore the depths of human courage in the face of adversity and the enduring fight for justice. We are always eager to hear your perspectives. What are your final thoughts on this intricate case? What lessons do you believe can be drawn from Justice Thornton's harrowing experience? Share your insights and opinions in the comments section below. Your engagement enriches our community and fuels our commitment to bringing you more stories that resonate and inspire.